Frida by Hayden Herrera is a biography of Frida Kahlo. Frida, of course, is from a past, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity by Kwame Appiah. Now this book I've already talked about is Lost Japan, Last Glimpse of Beautiful Japan by Kerr. Now this book came to shop, picked it up straight away. It's about a subject, the immeasurable world, like how much more macro can you get? And it's Journeys in Desert Places by William Atkins.
So, nonfiction November, I guess, is a time when we want to learn something. We read nonfiction to learn something new that we might not have known before. And I know that you definitely also can learn something from fiction, but I feel you go into a non-fiction book with the purpose of either learning greater knowledge about a subject that you already know quite well about, or you want to learn something completely new that you've never even heard about before, or you want to learn about someone who you really value and appreciate. Reading these non-fiction books in November is a time to learn more about things that you're generally, hopefully, interested in. And I think more than anything over this past month, in my participation of Nonfiction November, I've been learning more about myself as a reader of nonfiction and learning how perhaps my tastes have actually changed quite a bit to what I thought they originally were. Suffice it to say, the month didn't particularly go so well. There was a lot of umming and ahhing, kind of trying to figure out what I was after, what I was hoping for. I read 2 books from my TBR and I didn't enjoy them, and it kind of left me in a bit of a flux as to what would I enjoy, because they were the sort of books I thought I would enjoy the most, and it kind of put a halt in my TBR where I kind of panicked. Throughout the month of November, I've read 3 non-fiction books, which I think is pretty well. I've achieved at least reading 1 and I've achieved reading 3. And it's interesting because I looked back at the rest of my year in books and saw that there were actually a lot more non-fiction books throughout the year that I hadn't realised I had been reading. Some of them I've enjoyed a lot, some of them not so much, and I think the ones I have enjoyed have really started to actually reflect the way that my tastes have been changing and growing. So let's get into the books that I did read. The first book I read was Lost Japan by Kerr. Now this was the book I was most anticipating. This is the book that sounded perfect for me. It was exploring Japan, it was a travel writing piece, looking at sort of how modernity has interrupted the way that Japanese culture has been growing. And it's sort of about a man's kind of journey as he explores different parts of Japan and how he learns to love the country. I laugh because this is how the book is described, but I don't think it's actually what the book is genuinely about. I really did not enjoy this book. I think it is dated. I think it is ridiculously pretentious. I think it has the most insane whiff of colonialism and white superiority that I was kind of shocked that it had actually remained in print in this day and age. So I tried to pull out some of the good things about this book, and there weren't that many, to be honest, because the book was so drenched in the voice of an author that I did not care about in the slightest. There was some interesting discussions about how Japanese culture has been heavily imported, not only from China, but from Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries. And it kind of discusses the flux that Japanese culture was facing in the role that modernity is playing in a global arena. So there were those things that were kind of interesting and could have been done a lot better. This book, however, was atrocious. It was horrendous, and it really pained me to get through this book. It's about a guy who is from a military family. So then he, of course, goes to Yale, and of course he then goes to Oxford. In the time that he's in Yale and Oxford, he also does a year in Japan, studying in one of the top universities in Tokyo, and he is constantly complaining about how he had to go through 4 years of Yale, and then how he didn't want to go to Oxford, but he just had to because he got a scholarship there, and he didn't want to study whatever he studied because it wasn't what he wanted to do with his life, but he felt he had to. And then he went to Japan to do a year there, and he bitched about that. He complained about how boring the lessons were and how he didn't care for the way that the Japanese students learned, so he just didn't go to any lessons. Instead, he chose to travel around Japan. And then he went over to America, where his friend from Yale introduced him to his dad, and then this friend's dad decided to give Alex $1,000 a month for doing nothing, literally for doing nothing, with the purpose that Alex could choose what he could do for this friend's dad to earn that money. So Alex spent three months earning $1,000 a month doing nothing, and then he was like, oh, maybe I can just collect art for this guy. And then that's what he does, and then he gets more money. And I'm just like, every single thing has been handed to this man on a silver platter. He hasn't had to work a single day in his life. Well, he's had to work jobs, but he hasn't had to work to get these jobs. He writes about how he has this yearning for Japan. He has this idea of what Japan is, through kind of learning the history of Japan. So then he gets to Japan, he's like severely disappointed that Japan isn't what he wanted it to be, and that it's lost its 1,000-year-old history. Japan has lost its culture that was thriving 1,000 years ago, just much like anywhere else in the world. And he complains about how the Japanese don't care, and the Japanese have lost their culture, and how he is the only person in Japan who cares, and how he's fighting for this culture, and how he's like being worshipped by the Japanese for saving their culture. And I'm just like, this is disgusting. This is vile and horrible, and it's not how it works. Like, he had an expectation. That expectation wasn't met. So he then blamed an entire nation for not catering to his white fantasy of the Orient. And he then, by going over and learning these traditional arts and these traditional cultures, he is then saving Japan. He complains about literally everything. And it's this role of modernity, apparently, that is destroying Japan, and the role of sort of westernization, which at the same time, he keeps on talking about how Japan need to be more Western, that Japan need to learn from the Americans how to do business, the Japanese need to learn from Americans and the Europeans as to what to do with their electricity. They need to learn what to do with their sewage and their waste and everything. They need to learn to build nice rivers that don't disrupt scenery, because that's how they do it in Italy or whatever. And it's just like, this is absolute bollocks. Let freaking Japan be Japan. Let it learn its own identity in its own modern way, rather than being a Western modern place that caters to this white fantasy. And it made me so angry all the way through. That's what this book is about. It's about a white man who's bitching because his ideal Japan doesn't exist anymore, because that's the way that the world works. We develop. If you ever did fancy reading this book, because the way I had talked about it before I read it, then I'm sorry, but this probably isn't the book that you're looking for, and I don't recommend it to anyone. So after that book, I was like, oh, okay, that's upsetting. I need to read a book that I think I will enjoy, and I know I'll enjoy. So I read The Lies That Bind by Kwame and Appiah. Lo and behold, this book had almost the exact same issues as the first one. It's a book about identity and the myth of identity that Appiah is trying to debunk, and he is kind of arguing against this concept of identity that we have, supposedly. Now again, I feel that this book, even though it was published this year, this book is highly dated, and I don't know whether it's a generational divide, but the way that he talks about identity is a way that I think most people, at least in my generation, and I know that people in the generation above mine already understand and know and kind of accept quite widely. So he's talking about the role that identity plays, but his kind of term for identity I find to be very loose and very generalized. And he does say that, you know, we as a global collection tend to generalize when it comes to identities. And he says that that is a problem. But then he kind of then goes on and continues to generalize and doesn't actually problematize it properly, and doesn't problematize it when he uses it. So I also kind of buddy read this with Debbie, and Debbie felt very similarly to me, and she didn't even finish it. She gave it like a few chapters and was like, nope. And she kept on asking me whether she should stick to it, and I kept on saying, no, quite frankly, don't. This book is written by an older guy who has a very privileged background and likes to talk about how privileged his background is. Like, he likes to talk about the proper universities that he went to during his youth. He likes to talk about the relation to the Ghanaian royal family. He likes to talk about even the relation to the British royal family, or to very important people in the government and things. From the way that he talks about his past and his education and stuff, I get the impression that he values a very specific type of knowledge, and it's kind of like the knowledge that is most perpetuated at universities, because it's the knowledge that has been tried and tested, or really the knowledge that is coming from the old men's club. There are times, of course, where he does kind of utilise other different sort of trains of thought, and he does talk about a more diverse group of people and thinkers, but it's not enough, because what he's saying then kind of actually goes against a lot of what he's talking about, and the way that it's just laid out is just so boring. It's so full of himself, and it's just completely unnecessary, and in my opinion, I think he doesn't really add anything to any arguments, or he adds things to arguments that happened maybe 10 or 20 years ago, perhaps. And I just don't think this shouldn't have been made into a book. It was originally a group of lectures or a presentation or something that then got developed into a book, and it shouldn't have done. So that was my problem. I realised I had no care for reading from men who have gone to good universities and are very proud of having gone to those good universities, because I find that's all they ever talk about. They talk about how important they are because they've been to somewhere very prestigious, and they have learned from the greatest of peoples, and they are related to all these people who can afford them all of the luxuries that they then go on to do. And I think this is something that is very common in non-fiction, because of course the writer gets paid before they write the book, most of the time, in non-fiction. As opposed to fiction, where the writer gets paid after they've written the book, and they will then kind of get published based on the manuscript they've already written. With non-fiction, it tends to happen that they will just submit a kind of like, oh, here's what I want to write, and then they'll get paid to then go and do what they want to write, and then write about it, and then they'll get published. So I feel, because of that, in order for people to want to invest in your work and to invest in your non-fiction, you have to have a decent education, proof that you can write, in an academic or popular way. You have to have done all of these things to ensure that they're going to trust you to write a book. And in order to do all those things, you need to come from a very particular background to be able to afford to be able to do all those things. I think it's very much changing now. We're getting a lot of books from very diverse voices because of the way that being able to write online has opened up a lot of opportunities for people. But still, a lot of the top published non-fiction books seem to me to be coming from a very particular type of person, And I'm just getting fed up. Because these people are just so full of themselves and they think they're so important that what they have to say is the most important thing. Then we get books like these two, which just perpetuate really negative images of, the well-off man who thinks that they kind of own the world, and in kind of way do own the world, and just talk rubbish that I can't get on board. So that was my issue, and I was like, oh goodness, now what am I going to read? Because so much of my non-fiction I have is written by men, and so much of it is going to be by people who have gone to these good universities and will probably talk about these good universities. So I was thinking about maybe reading Frida, because the author's voice wasn't going to be about herself, it was going to be about Frida Kahlo. So I was like, okay, I can do that, but the book was so big that I was just a bit intimidated. So I eventually picked up this, which wasn't on my TBR, and it's The Map of Knowledge by Violet Moller. Now this is a book that's coming out in February next year. Yeah, it's coming out 21st of February 2019. It's a book that looks at 7 cities and how the knowledge from the classic Greek era survived throughout these 7 cities until today. So it kind of shows us the process that we as a modern society was able to keep the knowledge from an ancient society. And it was so interesting. It talked about how, it originally came from the Greeks and the Egyptians, and how this knowledge was shared across the Mediterranean. And then when, with the role that Christianity played in kind of the destruction of knowledge, it talked about how actually a lot of Muslim scholars were the ones who retained the knowledge and kept the knowledge going throughout Europe, in Spain when the Caliphate was there. And it was just so fascinating. I absolutely loved this book. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting, because there were glimmers of narrative non-fiction at the start of every part, because each part is based in a city, and each city, that chapter started with an historic figure, and it kind of had this almost narrative non-fiction way in that it talked about the life of this figure and how they ended up in the city, and it was really beautifully written. But then as the chapter progressed, it kind of deviated a lot more from that person and focused a lot more on the city, and became a lot more kind of just like fact after fact after fact after fact. And as it went through the times and it was tracing these concepts and this knowledge, the closer it got to the modern society, the more webs there were, and the harder it was to then kind of keep track of like who was who and where each book was at each time and how many versions of that book there were. She did very well to kind of retain it, but there were times where I felt like it got a little bit out of control, and as a reader I was a little bit confused. However, overall, I learned so much from this book. It was written beautifully. There was only one part at the very start of the book where her own experience played a role, but it was literally the most casual thing, and it just felt very real and very sincere, and I was just like, yeah, okay, that's all I needed to know. A very brief background that makes you look like an actual normal human being like everybody else in the world, and then taking a step back and giving the people their chance to tell a story. And maybe it's the fact that it's a history as opposed to travel writing or somebody's thoughts on identity that made it the author's voice wasn't so present. But I just genuinely think that it was the writer. It's the writer who made a conscious decision to not put herself in the text so much, to not value her opinion over anything else, because at times there are opinions. It may be a book on history, but there are so many parts of the history which are kind of having to be guessed at because there are no solid facts, and she makes that clear. She's like, we can't be certain, but because of this, and this, I find it's very safe to assume that this is so. And so reading this just kind of gave me that breath of fresh air that I really needed, that helped me get back into enjoying non-fiction. And, it's given me food for thought that I think in the future, when I'm going to read non-fiction again, I'm going to have to very much bear in mind who the author is and what their background is and how much they're going to talk about their own selves as opposed to the topic of the book. So that was definitely a learning curve, and something that perhaps might not have happened had I not read 2 books one after the other that were very similar in that respect. So I think, Nonfiction November didn't go as planned, but I learned a lot from it nonetheless, and I'm really pleased with how it went. And I did at least read 1 book that I really enjoyed. So I think it was a success in some way. Right, sorry for the rant and all that jazz, but yeah, that's what happened. I'll see you next time for another video. Bye bye.